Today we are going to discuss two nerves coming from the posterior cord called axillary nerve and radial nerve. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify the root value and the origin of axillary and radial nerves, describe the course and the branches of the axillary and the radial nerves, predict the effects of injury of such nerves. Let us begin with the axillary nerve. Origin, as the circle in blue here indicates, it is one of two terminal branches of the posterior cord of the brachial plexus. The root value of axillary nerve is C5 and 6. As you can see here in the diagram, this is which is marked by the arrow. This is the quadrangular space. As you can see, the yellow structure here is the axillary nerve, accompanied with the posterior circumflex humeral artery. Then let us read down below the course of axillary nerve. The nerve with the posterior circumflex humeral artery, both they pass in the quadrangular space around the surgical neck of the humerus. So it is liable to be injured by fracture of this part of the humerus, surgical neck, or by dislocation of the shoulder joint. Branches and distribution. As you can see here, there is a letter J, meaning the axillary nerve itself, before it terminates, it supplies the shoulder joint capsule, which is marked by the green color. Now, if you can focus on the yellow structure here, which is the axillary nerve, the axillary nerve begins to divide into two divisions, anterior and posterior division. Let us see this structure marked by the arrow, and the letter A is the anterior division. As you can see, anterior division terminates into the deltoid muscle, which is marked by the rectangle in blue. Now the other terminal branch is the posterior division, marked by the arrow and the letter P. It supplies what? It supplies, you can see a recurrent branch going to teres minor, and then it terminates into deltoid. After supplying the deltoid, it gives rise to this branch, which is cutaneous, upper lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm, marked by this rectangle in black. Now, how can we study this? We can study it from here. Right. What is the upper lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm supply? This is the upper lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm. It supplies the skin over the lower half of deltoid muscle. Lower half of the deltoid muscle, the skin over it is supplied by the upper lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm. So what about from down below, from the level of insertion of deltoid till the elbow? I think this is supplied by the lower lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm. Let us see in this lecture where does it originate. This is a diagrammatic summary of the axillary nerve. Let us begin from above downward. Here, this is the axillary nerve, the root value of which is C5 and C6. The nerve trunk supplies the shoulder joint, which is surrounded by the oval in green, and then it divides into anterior division and posterior division. Anterior division supplies only deltoid, posterior division supplies teres minor plus deltoid again, and then it terminates by the upper lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm to skin over the lower half of deltoid. So the shoulder joint supplied by the axillary nerve in green. The deltoid has double supply from the anterior division and the posterior division of the axillary nerve, and the rectangles in blue are supplied only by the posterior branch of axillary nerve. Let us go to the effect of injury. Here on the diagram you can see fracture in the surgical neck of the humerus. So axillary nerve can be easily affected in a patient suffering from fracture surgical neck of the humerus, or inferior dislocation of the shoulder joint as manifested in the diagram below. So what are the effects of injury of axillary nerve? Let us remove the lower diagram. Now you have here flat shoulder and the prominent acromion. Why? Because there is deltoid paralysis. You know that deltoid muscle preserves or gives the shoulder its rounded contour. Now deltoid muscle is paralyzed, so there is wasting of deltoid muscle. So the bony prominences, namely acromion, will be prominent, and the shoulder will lose its rounded contour, meaning flat shoulder. As you can see the arrow here in green corresponding to the letters in green. Now deltoid paralysis and atrophy, you know, this is number 2. Deltoid here is paralyzed. The arrow changed to the same color of number 2. And when you have a deltoid muscle paralysis, this means that only one action will be manifested on the patient, which is impaired arm abduction from 15 to 90 degrees. Also, the skin over the lower half of the deltoid will be sensory loss, like that. This area of skin, if you pinprick this area of the skin, the patient will feel nothing. So loss of sensation on the skin over the lower half of the deltoid. Now let us summarize. This is flat shoulder. This is deltoid atrophy. And this is the area of sensory loss over the lower half of the deltoid muscle. We're done with the axillary nerve. Let us move to the radial nerve. Radial nerve, as you can see the oval here in green, it is one of 2 terminal branches of the posterior cord of brachial plexus. The root value of radial nerve is everything, just like medial nerve. So medial nerve and the posterior cord, by the way, and radial nerve, the root value of all of these is the same, everything, C5, 6, 7, 8, T1. Now, what is this? The radial nerve is colored green here. So you can see this is subscapularis in red. The dark blue thing here is teres major, and this is in brown here is latissimus dorsi muscle and its nerve. You can see if you move up to the scapularis muscle, you can see the posterior cord giving rise to the upper and lower subscapular nerves, and in between there is a longer nerve which is the thoracodorsal nerve or nerve to latissimus dorsi. Let us move to the left side of the screen. The posterior cord divides into two terminal branches, one of which we have just discussed, which is the axillary nerve, passing into the quadrangular space together with the posterior circumflex humeral artery. The continuation of the posterior cord is called the radial nerve, which first passes between the third part of axillary artery and the posterior wall of axilla, namely subscapularis, teres major, and latissimus dorsi. So this is the origin of radial nerve, coming from the root value of C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1. It arises from the posterior cord. It passes between the axillary artery and the posterior wall of axilla here, and then it comes downward in this arrow together with profunda brachii artery in the lower triangular space, and then it continues in the spiral groove with the same artery, profunda brachii artery. Now radial nerve pierces the lateral intermuscular septum in order to become anterior. I leave you in a second to just have a second look to this slide. Now, this is the termination of radial nerve, and this circle above in the upper part of the diagram, this is the where radial nerve pierces the lateral intermuscular septum in order to become anterior. Then the radial nerve, just before termination, it passes in a muscular groove between brachialis here in red and the brachioradialis. Obviously, you can expect that it will supply both. Then as we go downward, it passes again between brachialis, but this time between extensor carpi radialis longus. It also supplies both. In front here, the third arrow, in front of the lateral epicondyle, it terminates, the radial nerve terminates by dividing into two terminal branches, superficial radial, which seems to be the downward continuation, and another branch called posterior interosseous nerve. May I ask you, from where anterior interosseous nerve arises? Oh, right, from the median nerve. I will drive your attention to this point. Radial nerve terminates in front of the lateral epicondyle. Remember that ulnar nerve was passing posterior to the medial epicondyle and liable to be injured there. Let us revise together the origin of radial nerve. It is the continuation of the posterior cord. It passes behind the third part of axilla artery between it and the posterior wall of axilla. And as we discussed the last lecture, since it arises from the posterior cord, it will be distributed to the back or extensors of the upper limb, both muscles and the skin over them. And again, this is summary in writing about the course of the radial nerve. Let us go to the branches. You have here 1, 2, 3, 4 arrows. Let us see in the first arrow, the above one. While the radial nerve passes in the lower triangular space, you know, lower triangular space between the humerus and two heads of triceps as well as the teres major. So in the axilla, branches from the radial nerve obviously supply the triceps and gives rise to posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm. Of course, we are expecting that radial nerve, since it arises from the posterior cord, it will supply skin and the muscles of the back of the upper limb. So this is the first cutaneous nerve supplying the back, posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm, and the muscle on the back of the arm called triceps. Let us see here the second arrow branches from the radial nerve while passing in the spiral groove. Spiral groove, you know, it lies between the lateral head and the medial head of triceps. So fair enough to expect that these branches will supply again triceps. And there is another muscle on the back of the elbow, but it lies down below in the back of the elbow. So the radial nerve, let us see, catches the chance to send a nerve which passes all over the back of the humerus to reach the anconeus. So it gives rise to two muscular branches, triceps and anconeus, and gives rise to two cutaneous branches, which are, of course, posterior cutaneous nerve of the forearm. We are expecting that. And another nerve which actually completes the upper lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm arising from the axillary. So this nerve is called lower cutaneous nerve of the arm. It supplies the skin from the level of insertion of deltoid till the elbow on the lateral surface of the arm. Now, in the muscular groove, as it emerges after piercing the lateral intermuscular septum, it passes between brachialis and brachioradialis, and then brachialis and extensocarpioradialis longus, so it will supply these three muscles. As you can see that it is supplying the radial nerve itself before termination. It supplies number 1 triceps, number 2 anconeus, number 3 brachialis, number 4 brachioradialis, number 5 extensocarpioradialis longus. 5 muscles. And how many cutaneous nerves? Let us see. Posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm and the forearm, and the lower lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm. Now let us see the two terminal branches here in front of the lateral epicondyle, which is superficial radial, which is purely cutaneous, and the posterior interosseous nerve, which is purely motor or muscular. Again, this is to compare the lower part of the radial nerve, which is superficial radial, on both diagrams. So let us see. Let us take one by one. As you can see here, radial nerve in front of the lateral epicondyle, dividing into two terminal branches. On the lateral side of the diagram here and here, this is brachioradialis in brown. And as you go downward, now extensocarpioradialis longus arises. It is colored blue on the right side of the diagram. Now, as you can see, this is supinator muscle. Supinator muscle is pierced by the posterior interosseous nerve, here and here. As we go downward, this is the superficial radial nerve on the lateral side of the back of the forearm. Superficial radial nerve passes downward on the left side of the diagram, superficial to extensor retinaculum, and then it terminates how? It is purely sensory. So it supplies the lateral 2/3 of the dorsum of the hand and the dorsal aspect of proximal phalanges of the lateral 3.5 fingers. So what is the nerve supplying the dorsal aspect of the distal 2 phalanges? Of course, it is medial nerve. If you see the other side, the right diagram here, you can imagine the following relations of the superficial radial nerve. So it is partly covered by brachioradialis. So superficial to it is brachioradialis. In the lower part of the forearm, it is only covered by skin and fascia. Lateral to it is also brachioradialis. Medial to it is the radial artery. Posterior to it is radius. So it is surrounded by everything called radius. It is the radial nerve, yes. Superficial to it is brachioradialis and the skin and fascia. Lateral to it is brachioradialis. Medial to it is radial artery. Posterior to it is radius. And this is the summary of 2 terminal branches. Let us revise again the posterior interosseous nerve, which is colored green because it is purely motor, number 1, the course of which is pierces supinator muscle and then passes between superficial and deep extensor of the forearm. As you know from your study, it passes in the 4th extensor compartment and ends on the back of the carpal bones. Superficial radial on the right side of the diagram, it is purely sensory, relations of which anteriorly is brachioradialis and skin and fascia, posteriorly is radius, lateral to it is brachioradialis again, medial to it is radial artery. If you compare it to posterior interosseous, it passes also in an extensor, superficial to extensor retinaculum. Posterior interosseous nerve passes in the 4th extensor compartment. Ends by supplying the superficial radial nerve again, ends by supplying the skin of the lateral 2/3 of the dorsum of the hand and the dorsal aspect of the proximal phalanges of the lateral 3.5 fingers. Branches and distribution. This table summarizes them all. Number 1 in the axilla, 1 muscular, 1 cutaneous branch, muscular to what? To long and medial heads of triceps. Sensory to the skin of the back of the arm, as the name implies, posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm. Number 2, in the spiral groove, 2 muscular branches to the triceps, lateral and medial heads of the triceps, plus anconeus. 2 sensory branches, lower lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm, sensory to the skin of the lateral side of the arm below deltoid tuberosity, posterior cutaneous nerve of the forearm, of course, sensory to the skin of the back of the forearm. In the intermuscular groove, only muscular branches to brachialis, brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus. And in front of the lateral epicondyle, you have 2 terminal branches, superficial radial, superficial to extensor retinaculum, to supply the sensory branches to skin of lateral 2/3 of the dorsum and dorsal aspect of proximal phalanges of the lateral 3.5 fingers, as well as posterior interosseous nerve, which pierces the supinator muscle to supply motor fibers to the rest of the extensors of the forearm. Remember that extensor carpi radialis longus, which is one of the extensor of the forearm, it is supplied by the radial nerve itself before it terminates into superficial radial and posterior interosseous. To summarize radial nerve distribution again, it supplies motor fibers to, by itself, radial nerve itself, 5 muscles. You can summarize them in tabib, which is your profession in Arabic. Tabib. T stands for triceps, A stands for anconeus, B stands for brachialis, E here stands for extensor carpi radialis longus, and then B here stands for brachioradialis. While the posterior interosseous nerve supplies the rest of the forearm extensors except extensor carpi radialis longus. What about the sensory distribution? By the radial nerve itself, it supplies 3 cutaneous branches: posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm, lower lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm, posterior cutaneous nerve of the forearm. While via its superficial radial branch, it supplies skin of the lateral 2/3 of the dorsum of the hand and dorsal aspect of the proximal phalanges of the lateral 3.5 fingers. Now, this is the whole pathway. You can stay with it for a few seconds. And this is the sensory distribution of the radial nerve. Focus on the dark red color here. This is the posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm, the lower lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm, posterior cutaneous nerve of the forearm, and then skin over the lateral 2/3 of the dorsum of the hand, and the skin over the dorsal aspect of the proximal phalanges of the lateral 3.5 fingers. Now, let us try to solve this question. As regards the radial nerve, all the following statements are true, except it is a very vague question, but we are just doing it to revise our knowledge. At its beginning, it lies anterior to latissimus dorsi. I think this is correct. Supplies the skin of the back of the arm and forearm. I think this is correct. Posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm and forearm. It is the only supply of extensors of the elbow. Yes, very much indeed. Triceps and anconeus. It runs between long and medial heads of triceps in a spiral groove. Yes, it runs between 2 heads, but it's not medial and long. I think it is lateral and medial heads. Let us see number 5. Supplies a muscular branch which flexes the elbow. I think brachioradialis does that. Brachioradialis, what does it act? It acts to flexion of the elbow in semi or mid-prone position. So, oh yes. This is the wrong statement in the above 5 statements here. It runs between not long and medial, it runs between lateral and medial, so this will be the answer. Let us see another MCQ. Fracture midshaft of the humerus leads to, of course, median nerve injury. No. Radial nerve, ulnar nerve, if it cannot be like that, ulnar nerve passes behind the medial epicondyle. So in the midshaft of the humerus, this is the spiral groove. Yes, we mean radial nerve. Let us see the last part of the radial nerve. Actually, the last part of our lecture is injury of radial nerve. We are going to deal with injury of radial nerve in many places. Number A in the axilla. If you go to the diagram here on the right side of the screen, you will see it is affected, of course, by the fracture of the upper end or even the shaft. But mid shaft of the humerus, if you have a fracture here, you will injure the radial nerve, not in the axilla. In the arm maybe, but not in the axilla. So fracture in the upper end of the humerus, it will affect the radial nerve. This is one cause. The other cause is called the crutch palsy. This is the crutch. Sometimes the crutch is not supplied by hand grips here. So all the weight of the person lies on the handle here, the above here, in the axilla, put in the axilla. So after a while, after so many days of using the crutch, the radial nerve will be compressed in the axilla, leading to its injury. Lastly, I don't think we see it here in Egypt, so it is called Saturday night paralysis. Here is somebody who's hit, or maybe he's drunk. As you can see, his right arm here, it rests on this stand. Maybe it rests on a chair or something when he is drunk. So there is a continuous compression of the radial nerve against this chair or this stand here. It is called Saturday night paralysis because abroad they used to get drunk on Saturday in the weekend, so they may use a chair or something to rest their arm on it. Anyway, injury of radial nerve in the axilla leads to what? Sensory and motor. Number one, sensory. Actually, it is expected that the patient will suffer from sensory loss over these areas. Number one, lower lateral part of the lateral side of the arm, back of number two in here, back of the arm and back of the forearm and back of the hand, lateral 2/3 of the dorsum of the hand and the dorsal aspect of the lateral 3.5 fingers. This is expected areas of sensory loss. Clinically, the area of sensory loss is limited to the space here colored in blue, space between thumb and the index finger due to overlap between nerves. Let us go to number two. In the lowermost part of the left side of the screen, there is paralysis of SEB. What is SEB? Here, S stands for supinator, so there will be loss of supination. However, supination can be still done by the biceps, which is supplied by musculocutaneous nerve. Number two, E, stands for extensors of the elbow and wrist and fingers. Extensors of the elbow, I mean by them triceps and anconeus. Extensors of the wrist and fingers, when they become paralyzed, what will happen? There will be a deformity. This deformity is called finger drop and wrist drop. Since the flexors will take the upper hand, so they will flex the wrist and finger. So it seems that the wrist by the gravity and the fingers by the gravity are dropped. Actually, they are not by the gravity, they are dropped. They are dropped by the flexors of the wrist and fingers, which are still functioning by the median and the ulnar nerves. B stands for brachioradialis, so there will be loss of elbow flexion in mid-prone position. these are the motor effects of radial nerve injury in the axilla. Number 2 effect of injury, or number B, in the spiral groove. Here is the radial nerve can be affected by the fracture of mid-shaft humerus, as the diagram shows, or number 2, wrong intramuscular injection in the arm, affecting the triceps, going all through the triceps to injure the radial nerve, or using a tourniquet of the arm for long time. If you do compress the arm for a long time, then you are compressing the radial nerve as well. Anyway, the effects of injury of radial nerve in the spiral groove, let us see the motor and sensory. Spiral groove, meaning that you already gave nerve fibers to the triceps and anconeus. So the motor effects same as before, except the extension of elbow is now possible because triceps and anconeus are now working, but with the same deformity as we mentioned before, wrist drop and finger drop. Let us go to the sensory. Of course, if you have injury of the radial nerve in the spiral groove, now lower lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm, posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm and forearm, they are spared. These are normal. They are not affected. So the sensory loss will be in the lateral 2/3 of the dorsum of the hand. Number 2, into the dorsal aspect of proximal phalanges of the lateral 3.5 fingers, which are indicated on the lower diagram on the right side of your screen. Let us go to the effect of injury of the posterior interosseous nerve, which is purely motor, at the superior radioulnar joint, which can be injured here by fracture dislocation of the upper end or head of the radius. So dislocation of the superior radioulnar joint, fracture of the upper end or head of the radius may lead to injury of posterior interosseous nerve. Effects, of course, sensory effects nothing, because the nerve is purely motor. What about the motor effects? Brachyradialis and the extensor carpi radialis are also spared, so you have a little degree of wrist extension. So the deformity will not be wrist drop and finger drop, it is only finger drop. As you can see, we are putting the X or wrong mark on the wrist drop, but still there is finger drop. Number 4, effect of injury of the superficial radial nerve. So you know superficial radial nerve passes superficial to extensor retinaculum here? Yes. So it might be affected by cut wounds in the forearm during street fights, burglars, or whatever. So the effects will be motor effects, nothing. Of course, nothing, because the nerve is purely sensory. Again, the sensory loss of sensation is expected to be lost on the lateral 2/3 of the dorsum of the hand and dorsal aspect of the lateral 3.5 finger, but actually clinically the area of sensory loss is limited to the space between thumb and the index fingers due to overlap between the cutaneous nerves, as the lower diagram shows. Thank you.